Hey everyone. Before we jump into this week's podcast, which I think you'll really enjoy, I interview Shaun, who just released a horror book. Now, if you're interested in this genre, or you just like reading, or you need some inspiration for creative writing, whatever the reason is, I have all the links in the description. And this includes where to buy it, how to get a physical copy, how to get an ebook, and also the book cover, which we actually talk about in this podcast. Also, the ebook is 99 cents. So if you have a Kindle or you have any sort of tablet, then I do recommend it. Shaun spoke about wanting to give it away for free, but unfortunately, the website doesn't actually allow that. So 99 cents was the cheapest he could put it at. Regardless, if you just want some reading material or you want to support a young, aspiring artist, which I think is a great reason to buy something, then have a look and hopefully it's to your taste. Hi everyone, welcome to Safety Last. So today we have a guest. You're actually the second Canadian person on this podcast, and we have Shaun joining us. And Shaun, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Shaun. Yeah, I'm a writer from Malaysia, currently studying and living in Canada.
hmm Basically, Shaun created this message on a Facebook page, and he said, I am about to release my book. Check out the stuff, check out the images, and what caught my eye immediately was how like awesome the book cover was. And maybe you can take this as a segue to talk about the name of your book, when it's coming out, and also why you chose to do horror.
Oh, cool. Well, the name of the book is called Providence on All Fours. It's coming out on August 30th. Well, for me, horror is just something that um, has always been a massive part of my life growing up, just as a media. And just as an example, I used to read a lot of things such as true Singaporean ghost stories.
I've never
Um,
heard of that.
yeah, well, it was extremely popular back in like 2000.
hmm hmm
And essentially, I would read those books and get so scared that like I couldn't use the toilet. Like I would be too scared to leave my room at night in the dark. But at the same time, I loved that experience so much,
Uh huh.
and I love that like horror can kind of like create such an intense space that people can exist in for a while, and it's so visceral. You feel every moment in horror, and I just wanted to make that.
You know what's interesting? I feel like a lot of artists who work in the horror genre, their first experiences of horror have to do with the bathroom and the trip to the bathroom. I feel like this is honestly a reoccurring thing because I've like looked at other YouTube videos, listened to other podcasts with other horror writers or other famous writers in this genre, and they mention that midnight trip to the toilet. And I just think it's the vulnerability of firstly leaving the comforts
Absolutely.
of your bed, but also like the vulnerability of being like a cold, deserted place, and just the vulnerability of going to the bathroom and all of
Yeah.
that added together. There's just a real fear.
And also I think there's something about the fact that weird bugs have the capacity to live in the bathroom. Like, the house centipede shows up and you're totally vulnerable. Like you said, like you're in the middle of a pee,
uh,
and it's one of the most horrifying things. And then your brain just like goes completely crazy sometimes. Like,
mhm,
I remember like I would imagine like, oh my God, while I'm peeing, there's somebody right behind me
mhm,
right now. And
mhm.
just stuff like that, you know, would be coming from the stories that I read too.
Like I wonder how much that is us, our own brains, like playing a trick on ourselves and like creating a narrative so we could almost so like we can feel a heightened state of emotion. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Like, but I wonder if that's
Mm.
our brain. Like, oh, if there's someone behind us, and then like you look back and then there's that intense fear, but there's also that, whew, there's no one actually behind me. I wonder if that's I don't really have an answer for that, but is that
Yeah,
our
well,
brains like trying to create a situation where we feel this intense emotion?
I do feel like our brains kind of love to run and do whatever. Like
Mm-hmm.
our brains on a natural level just love being imaginative, I
Mm-hmm.
think. Whether we
Mm-hmm.
want it to happen or not. Like our
Mm-hmm.
brains just love that exercise, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also just like, I don't know, maybe I'm just an anxious person, like but like I'll be in the toilet and like when I was a kid especially, and the dark especially creates so many um it brings so many fears to life. It lets
Mm-hmm.
the imagination go so crazy, and you don't even have any choice in it, basically.
Mm. Let's come back to the book cover because I do want to mention this. You know, the downside of podcasts is the thing that I'm looking at. It's really hard to beam into the other person's head, into the
True.
audience's head. So maybe I'll slap an image of it, or put a link to it in the podcast. But just to describe it, it is two dogs, which are kind of facing each other. I'm probably not this. I'm not describing this well, but it's two dogs, and they share uh three. They have three eyes between them, so they have obviously an eye to themselves, and they have one eye in the middle, implying some sort of joined and fused um dog. This or hellhound. Is that how else would you describe it?
I think that's perfect. I think you described it really well. I,
Okay,
I think
you're just
it's
being
kind of
nice
hard to
now.
know what that. No, I'm serious. I think it's kind of hard to tell what animal it is too. But you're right. It looks like a dog.
Actually, now look at it. It also looks like a spider. Oh, this is creepy. Okay, it is genuinely a creepy image. And can I ask, why did you choose that title, Providence on All Fours?
Well, I'm extremely interested in our connection between nature
Mm-hmm.
and our connection with um things like mysticism or like strange and weird surreal experiences. And I was really interested in that intersection, and there's just so much about nature that is so strange and mysterious,
Mm-hmm.
and just in general things that we don't understand.
Yeah.
Like there's kind of a theme in the book of essentially people talk questioning whether animals can feel things, or
Mm-hmm.
questioning like whether it's possible to imagine how an animal feels.
Mm-hmm.
um and I just thought that there's such an intersection between like animals and spirituality, and providence basically translates to god.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really like this concept of just like nature as this completely ambiguous and weird thing,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, that we have no real understanding over, but yet we make so many changes to it, and at the
Mm-hmm.
same time we're a massive part of it. um yeah, and these all end up forming together in this weird giant mess, and that's why I thought providence on all fours was kind of interesting.
The great delusion is that humans are separate from nature. I think that's a myth.
Absolutely.
And what's also
Absolutely.
interesting, by the way, I'm not just agreeing or saying just because he's the guest. I've actually read some of the work that Sean sent me beforehand. So when you were talking about animals feeling or not, that definitely reminded me of one of the short stories, which is called "Nourishing Itself on the Walls of Our Home," and that
Hmm.
creepy aspect of it. Um, talking about animals and horror, when we think about aliens, we often think about them in a humanoid form. So they have a big head, maybe a huge head, for an enlarged brain. But on the other hand, if we just look at our surroundings, just look at the moth or the shark, they look so different and strange to us. Like
Oh
to me, it's
yeah.
hard to conceptualize. This might be a totally different topic, but it's hard for me to conceptualize aliens as resembling us when even the nature around us doesn't resemble us.
Absolutely. I totally agree, and there's just so much um that we don't even understand, like about how animals interact with the world. Like like just as an example, like how moths can essentially travel by how the how light's gravity works. And I don't really understand that on a conceptual level, but that is why they end up like going to light sources, because they're attracted to that gravity essentially that's created. And I can't even begin to say like that I can understand that. That's
Mm,
just such an alien experience. And other animals can feel, literally, they navigate through like the magnetic field of the earth, like hammerhead sharks. Like, that's not a part of the story, but like things like that about animals are so strange, and we can never imagine how that living experience must be like. And I find that really interesting.
mm. And I'm not sure if you read any of Edgar Allan Poe or
Hmm.
any of the old uh gothic, yeah, any of the old gothic horrors. But I read this book called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and it's written by Poe, and talking about nature and the weirdness of the world. It's a book about a person sailing through the sea and being shipwrecked, the the sailors on board cannibalizing each other because they run out of food, and it just transforms something as, I guess, I don't want to use the word mundane because the sea isn't mundane, but as as the sea's still a very regular part of our world. Like, we know what the sea looks like. We've all touched the sea and stuff like that, but it just transformed that symbol into something like terrifying and so bizarre. And it was one of the most terrifying books, along with Dracula. That was so terrifying.
Absolutely. And I what I love about that is just how it kind of, I feel like human beings like to enjoy feeling like we're in control of nature.
Hmm.
Like, we've kind of tamed it, and that
Hmm.
we've taken, and to a degree we have, like, there's no piece of uncultivated land to a
Hmm.
degree. But at the same time, we like to feel that power.
Hmm.
And then we like to, even in nature documentaries, it's all very beautiful nature. It's all
Hmm.
very, even the violent aspects of it are kind of like clean in a
Yeah,
way. But
sublime.
yeah, very sublime. But things like Edgar Allan Poe's like weird reversion of like, even cannibalism is like this extremely like intense and like old, as old to human beings, like need for hunger, like need for food essentially comes out, and that's all natural up to a point.
So just let's return to some of your works. Was there any moment that inspired you in particular when you said, "You know what? I'm going to go out and write this book"? Was there a
Mm.
particular experience? Was there a moment were you walking in a dark alleyway and then something jumped out at you? Like, what, apart from wanting to create art, which every artist would feel, was there any other formative experience along with the bathroom trip?
Well, I would say that I'm always going out into nature and taking walks and kind of enjoying what it looks like, but at the same time being aware of how, at the same time, brutal and cold nature can be,
Hmm.
the same way that human beings can be in the exact same way. I would say like, um growing up in Malaysia was such an experience, like growing up in and going to into the jungle as an example, and then seeing both like the intersection of intense wild nature and then like garbage bags in the middle of the jungle, full of rotting food and like full of plastic essentially.
Hmm.
And all of this like came together to make me think about like how to make those feelings um visceral and intense, and like something that becomes like a physical space that became stories, I guess.
Hmm.
And I would say a lot of the stories come from, have like a big part of like my own personal experience imbued in them. Like, they're very surreal and they're very fictional, but at the same time, um, a lot of my own experience with nature, my own experience with the feelings that it gives me, which are both beautiful and horrified at sometimes, are in the book.
Mm. So, like I said before, you sent me some of the short stories and I had to read before we're doing this interview. And what you said reminded me a lot of the first short story I read, which is Deep Green Gravity.
Mm.
And I remember reading it, and the first page was like, okay, this is a person and his grandfather. And then as I continue reading it, there was just this disgusting, sickly sheen that it made me very uncomfortable. And the only thing I can think of that somewhat resembles this, I don't know the name of it, but do you know the human fear of like circles or like or
Oh,
in like our skin or something? Do you know what I'm talking about? The
yeah,
um I have
like
no idea how to.
trypophobia.
Yes, that's it. That that was the feeling I got. This sense of like rot that was like
Mm.
coming out into us or coming out from our skin, and just it was uh
Thank
it
you
was
very much.
it was very uncomfortable.
No, and I agree with you that it is it's a very uncomfortable story at many points. But at the same time, I really, just being able to feel that space so viscerally, I really appreciate that, you
Mm,
know,
mm.
you were able to have that experience at the same time.
That's, I mean, that's fundamentally what every artist, every writer wants to do. And talking about your previous point where you said like all of this is somewhat because of my experiences, well, that's inevitable. And when people
Hmm.
ask me like the
Yeah.
book I'm writing, or in the final process of finishing, they ask me like, how much of this is based on you? And I always say like, even if the main character and me are different, even if we have different names or we come from different backgrounds, inevitably it's hard not to write about yourself. And
Oh
when you
yeah.
talk about like, Malaysia and spending time in the jungles or in the forest or in nature, I can definitely see that in your story. So for example, Deep Green Gravity is the story of the protagonist in the jungle, and then we move on to Anger in the Night, which in the late night. Sorry, correct if I'm wrong, but it's a story set in the snowy fields or mountains.
Yeah. It's somewhere in like a rural area full of snow, essentially.
So yeah, I can definitely see these natural experiences, or these experiences that you've had in nature reoccurring in your stories. Can
Hmm.
I ask a question about your writing? Now, this when I saw it, my first reaction was like, "Wow, that is unusual." In Deep Green Gravity, so the story about the jungle, you include a person who speaks like multiple languages. So you shift from like English responses, and then you shift to like some Chinese, and then you shift, you just shift all over the place. And
Hmm.
I guess my question is like, I don't think I've ever seen that. Actually, maybe I have seen. I don't know. I'm not sure if I've ever seen that before. But why did you do that? And how did you come to that conclusion? Let's include this, because it can also be confusing to shift between these different languages. So why did you end up choosing that choice?
Yeah. Well, I would say that I was definitely partially inspired by a number of Canadian Indigenous writers, actually.
Hmm.
And their writing, I noticed that. Oh man, I'm trying to remember the name of this book now. But just as an example, a book such as The Marrow Thieves. There's another book that I'm thinking of, but a book like The Marrow Thieves, like Charlie Dimeline, its characters speak essentially Anishinaabe, and there is not always an explanation for what they say, and I thought that was really subversive and really powerful because a lot of our media comes from the Western eye and from a Western perspective. And just as an example, growing up in Malaysia, we had so much Western media, and just kind of the expectation that you would understand English, and just the expectation that you will be able to understand this language, even though you don't come from a country that understands any of the culture that's on the screen, or any of the social norms that are happening on the screen, or even in the book. And I just wanted to make something that was from a perspective, and from my own space, essentially. And I didn't want to hold the reader's hand through that, necessarily, especially in a time when we have Google Translate and we have the technology to bridge that gap. Like the story has different languages, but I think there's still enough English to be super accessible,
Hmm.
and then the different languages kind of become nuggets of things that can be searched further into, if the reader wants to,
Hmm.
while maintaining a world that feels like it's mine.
Okay. Well, tell me if you think this is a fair assessment or unfair assessment. But most artists, and I would include myself in this category, they want their book to um, be as immersive as possible. I would say that's the general idea. Like you want your writing to feel like a movie that people play in their head, and you want to iron out all the errors or anything to make the ride as smooth as possible. Are you purposely in that one story, because I only see it once, are you purposely trying to disrupt the experience and also highlight there are other cultures or other worlds that exist beyond just an English speaking world?
Hmm. Well, I would say it depends on who you are when you read the book.
Mm,
Like somebody from Malaysia who understands the languages that exist there will be able to read that and feel very immersed, I believe, or at
good
least
point.
feel like they're absolutely in that space.
Hmm.
Um, and and I just want to give that sort of experience, and I'm hoping too that like already the setting of the jungle is so antagonistic, like it kind of goes against concepts of norms in a lot of ways, or you're like it's just such, it just breaks away from human attempts to tame it in so many ways. And I think having those multiple languages come in and be a sort of difficulty, an added level for people who don't speak these languages, it's kind of adds that interesting layer, I hope, anyway.
You know, that really reminds you of the Gothic function. So in the Gothic, you have places such as city centers or metropolitan areas where it's the norm, it's the linear, it's the structured. And then the further you get away from these areas of quote unquote civilization, it becomes weirder. And you even see
Mm.
this in Shakespeare's writing, like whether it's what's it called? Summer Nights. What's that called? Midsummer's Night Dream, where
Oh
these
yeah.
people, as they move away from the urban, they come into a land of magic and romance and feelings and fairies and and supernatural. And is that also what you were trying to do? Like you tried to, similar to what I said about Edgar Allan Poe with the ocean, you tried to recast these areas such as the snowy fields or the jungle as these impenetrable areas where human logic doesn't work.
Mm. Yeah, I would say to a large degree that is what I'm trying to do. But I think I'm also really interested because that creates kind of like a dynamic again. I think like as an example with Poe's story of like the further you leave civilization, the more wild it becomes. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, like that clearly that does happen. But I'm also really interested in how human beings are still very much animals in a lot of ways.
Mm.
Very sophisticated animals, but that like even in our urban areas, the kind of weirdness that comes from being a part of nature still exists.
I definitely saw that in the. I keep talking about the jungle story, but perhaps it was the first one I read. But it really struck me with how just uncomfortable I felt. But I guess that would be expressed through maybe the grandfather and just his. He seems to move so. He seems to be so human at one sense, and then also so animal. Maybe there's
Mhm.
nothing to really distinguish between these two categories, but he seems at sometimes to be, the loving grandfather, and then the other time like a person really caught in like fear and terror and things like that. So
Mhm.
it was, yeah, I do see aspects of you blurring that divide which literature and art would traditionally uphold.
Mhm. Yeah, and I really appreciate you saying that. Absolutely.
Mm,
Um because I feel a lot of those feelings a lot of the time, like sort of that anxiety, and I think things like nature explain a lot to me in a number of ways. You know, like that kind of weird anxiousness that like fight or flight response that people get, you know, and that can really cloud our brain sometimes. I think it's something that we all deal with from time to time, and it scares us a lot of the time too. But I think coming to accept it and then to understand that we can do better is what I'm really interested in as well.
Um, I've got a question. I want you to answer with, out of 10, with 10 being a lot and, one being not so much. But as I was reading your work, just a name kept popping up into my head. And I felt like that there's, Shaun must have read this person. Like, there's no way that he hasn't read this person. So, out of 10, how much of your writing or how much of your idea of horror was inspired by Ito Junji?
Oh, honestly, a 9 out of 10 in my opinion. I think Junji Ito's work is well, Uzumaki left a massive impression on me in my freshman year of university, my first year,
That
and
novel, or no, that manga, I purchased it to read it myself, and
mhm.
it, I never want to read it again.
I know it made me
It's
feel sick.
so
It
good,
gave
but
me
I
fever, kind of.
I never want to read it again. Like, it's a great piece of art, but like, never. Like, I just, I don't know. I'm good. I'm good,
Yeah,
Ito. No more for me.
absolutely. And I just love work that creates such intense space like that. You know, like you can feel every single moment in that book like it's something that's organic that just exists there. And it kind of follows a logic into something that's completely insane, but at every turn you're like, okay, I mean that makes sense,
Mm.
even though it's extremely weird.
Yeah. For anyone who hasn't read it, the book Uzumaki, which I think translates to circle or spiral in Japanese, it is about a town that is dominated or controlled by or intimidated by a spiral, which I know sounds ridiculous. It sounds, for anyone who hasn't read it, you're thinking like, what on earth is this person talking about? But the idea of the spiral comes to dominate the town so completely that it's, I don't even know how else to say it apart from it is just bizarre. And would you say, because Ito has influences from Lovecraftian horror, which is just this horror which is so cosmic and so overwhelming that humans just can't understand it. Do you think you have aspects of that in your own writing? Because Ito was very influenced by that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to a degree, I have read Lovecraft, um, but I always thought that Lovecraft did not do such a good job of like he did a very good job of creating like insane monsters and insane like Dagon is like one of my favorite Lovecraft stories, which is like just this like image of this alien shore full of dead fish and then this giant monster at the end. But his writing is very inaccessible and it doesn't pull me in a way that, as an example, like Ito's stories are able to, or even other horror writers.
Can you give me an
Um,
example of like what you mean by unable to pull you in?
as an example, Lovecraft does a lot of the oh, it's right behind the door. It's right there. I'm terrified of it. It's gonna come in any moment now. I'm horrified. The thing is right behind the door. Or he'll say something like, "Oh, and it was so bad that I could not even imagine it." I think this is gonna happen because it's so early on, and he really started this kind of weird genre. But now there's so many better ways of building up that atmosphere and kind of creating something that feels a lot more satisfying while not exposing the monster in any way. There's still so many interesting ways to build upon what Lovecraft kind of began. And so while I appreciate his stuff, there are a lot of issues at the same time, I think. Just
Mm,
with pacing, among other things.
interesting. So,
Yeah.
what's your big takeaway from writing all this horror? Do you plan to continue in this genre, or have you thought about? I'm not sure if you've even thought about your next book, but is horror something you want to continue writing? Just continue writing in over and over again.
Yeah, well, I think horror will always be a part of my writing style no matter what, because I just have this writing style that feels very uncomfortable. I
Mm,
think in a lot of ways it's
mm-hmm,
very close up, and it's very anxious a lot of the time. It's
mm-hmm,
that kind of very strange writing style at times, and I think I just gravitate to the kind of concepts that horror affords. But at the same time, I would love to write other things. Like there's so much. I think horror is as a genre can do a lot of different things.
mm. And you know how you said before you felt like your writing was very uncomfortable. What are a few other adjectives that you would use to describe your book and your stories, apart from
um,
uncomfortable?
I would try. I mean, I hope anyway. These are the adjectives that I hope my book creates. But I mean, it's kind of face melting a little bit. It's very intense and up close descriptions. It's very weird things happen. People are panicked a lot of the time, but at the same time, I hope it's very pretty. I think there are a lot of quiet moments, and it's very peaceful when it isn't completely high octane
Mm-hmm.
fear
That's
and
word.
intensity.
Mm-hmm. And something else I really like, and perhaps this is just because I grew up in a metropolitan area, and I'm guessing so did you.
Hmm.
Because of this, stories like Dracula, which, like I said, was just terrifying for me. Whilst I appreciate it a lot, it always put the horror as something, like it's something that existed in like a castle. To me, that's what I think of when I think of like Dracula. There's always something like, far away in, was it like Transylvania or something, a strange place, an exotic land, and these horrors, come in those areas, and then they sometimes brush against us in the more quote unquote civilized part of the world. Yet your writing seems to, and I know we've touched upon this before, but I don't think I've just given you the praise for that. Like, it seems to blur the lines between the exotic lands and the unexotic lands, or the familiar, and similar to Ito, and that's why I asked, if you were influenced by him. You're able to find the horror in the mundane, the everyday.
Hmm.
And I find that, as a person who lived in the suburb and in the city area, like, to me, that's just as interesting, or that is interesting.
Yeah, well, I really really appreciate you saying that, and I think I don't know that there are a lot of hidden feelings that people experience all the time that aren't said, that are very invisible. And a lot of those feelings are not always positive. They're not negative either. I mean, it's always such a soup of various emotions that we go around with every day. And I think horror is so good at kind of dissecting all those different feelings, and sort of intensifying those feelings and making them apparent. And I don't know. I feel like there's a lot to learn from sitting with those feelings. And I think horror is so good at sending necessary at giving important and necessary reminders sometimes in a way that's very instant and visceral.
Yeah, I think the positive thing about horror is it immediately shocks you and takes you out of this very linear, very structured lifestyle we have.
Hmm.
I remember watching. This isn't really horror, but I remember watching a David Attenborough documentary and just seeing the beauty on screen, and just for a moment thinking like, there is life beyond, 9:30 wake up, and 6:30 come back from work lifestyle. Like, there
Hmm.
is like a whole world out there which we don't always interact with because of just how structured our life is, but it is there and it lurks beneath the surface. And it only takes something like a horror story or like a beautiful romance or anything to break us out of that loop and show us that there are other facets, other worlds beyond just what we know.
Absolutely. I totally totally agree with that. And yeah, I think that's things like writing are so good at creating perspective, and forcing people to sort of make that exercise of dealing with a different perspective.
Hmm.
And I just love what horror allows.
Absolutely. So, Sean, give us some more. To end up with this, to end on this, give us some more information about your book. Where can we get it? Maybe the blurb, or like, when is it coming out? Just any more information so the audience and me can go, look and do some research on this and find out when we can get it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's going to be published through Amazon, available through Kindle.
Hmm.
It will have a paperback version along with hopefully an extremely cheap or a free ebook version. It will be out on August 30th. And yeah, I hope that you enjoy the book. It is super weird, and I hope that you like that kind of thing.
Mm.
Anyway.
Just to jump in, so when I was talking to Shaun before this, so this is the pre-recording stuff. I just remember talking to Shaun and asking him questions about, like, how much do you want to charge for your ebook and stuff. And another reason I asked this is, as my listeners will know, I am pretty close to releasing my book. So because of that, I'm just trying to get as
Mhm.
much information about ebooks, hardback, paperback books, etc. And Shaun gave a magnificent answer, and he said something along the lines of, because I'm an artist, for me, the most important thing is actually getting these stories across, because I think I want people to listen to them, and I think they have some value. And he said, because of that, he's thinking about either giving out for free or selling it for as cheap as possible, because the art is just as important or more important than actually the marketing or the business side. So because of that, I think that alone, I think is just such an awesome mindset, and I think that captures the artist spirit really well. So I mean, if you can't think of another reason to support this dude, I think that's a good enough reason.
Thanks so much, Stanley. That's honestly really really nice of you to say, and I seriously appreciate that.
All good, all good. Well, what we'll end it with there. So thank you for joining us, Shaun, and thank you, audience, for joining us on Safety Last. All of Shaun's links, the any websites or any Instagrams or any social media platforms, all of that we put in the link. So if you want to check it out, please do. Apart from that, have a good day, and I hope you are well.
Thank you for tuning in to Safety Last with Stanley Ching. If you enjoyed this, then please leave a rating or a comment. I hope you're leaving with a new idea, and make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and other places that can be found in the description.